Well, thank you. Thanks for giving up an afternoon to listen to someone prattle on about science fiction and stuff. And when the principal talks about academic excellence, I'm not sure you've got the right person talking about spirituality of Star Wars and things of that sort, because often when I talk about these things, within Christian circles, I feel a little like this. I don't feel like it today because you've already been so warm, but do you know what I mean? There's a sense in which really this seminar should be about a line-by-line exposition of the Colossian text that I used this morning and that I'll use again a little bit this evening, not going off into the wild region of movies and novels and things of that sort. And many Christian people who I meet who are interested in these things feel a little bit embarrassed that they are. I teach some first-year Anglican ordinands, and I normally ask them a question when we start. What television do you watch? And the normal answer is, oh, we don't watch any television at all. So you push a bit further and they say, well, we watch David Attenborough, something really laudable. Whereas I know that what they're watching is exactly the kind of things that I'm watching. But there's a reticence, there's an embarrassment about popular culture. We may come back to that a little later. One of the things that we've been doing in Durham, and we're delighted to be working with LST on this, is a project called Equipping Christian Leaders in an Age of Science. And this is a project between Durham University and York University and the Church of England, and a number of seminaries around the country, colleges like LST. And what we're particularly working with is church leaders and helping them to engage, we hope, with science. And a great deal of the way that we engage with science is actually mediated in narratives and stories, not least within the world of popular culture. And one of our most popular conferences, and by the way, that's a website if you want to have a look at it, one of our most popular conferences we held for bishops and senior church leaders and parachurch leaders just a couple of weeks ago. And it was on science fiction and how you engage theology within science fiction. And one of our guests was Ted Chiang. Ted Chiang is an American author, science fiction writer. He's the person whose story is behind that movie that's shown there called Arrival. Let me just make sure have I got a pointer on this? I guess I have. Yeah, there we go. And we invited Ted to come and talk with a group of theologians and senior church leaders. And one of the things he said, I'm not religious. He kept saying that, just to make sure that we knew that he wasn't religious. But he said, I'm fascinated by theological questions. He said, the only trouble is I never get invited to talk with theologians or church leaders. This is the first time I've been invited to talk with theologians and church leaders. Science fiction stories explore questions of human existence. They are a mythology of today, and with much popular culture, they pose questions largely about what it means to be human. Now, as I begin this, I don't want to be naive about the complexity of science fiction. It is a complex genre spanning movies, television, literature. They're all slightly different. Different franchises and themes are different. It's difficult to talk about something in the round. And I don't want to be naive either that there isn't a use of science fiction and popular culture that is a carrier wave for certain values. So that when the Phantom Menace trilogy of Star Wars movies appeared, Roger Enrico the CEO of Pepsi Cola, signed up the franchise for advertising and said, this will allow us to connect with virtually every consumer in the world. And so popular culture does, as a carrier wave, bring with it consumerism and certain values embedded in the authorial intention or context of those who create it. We have to, I think, be aware of that as Christians and critical of it in the right kind of way. I also want to say that even if you go into the Marvel universe or Marvel universes, the complexity there is huge just within that particular form of science fiction, of characters, of interacting stories, of timelines, of who owns the franchise. Is it Disney or Sony? And the mixing of mythology, of divinity and science and story going on. However, I think there are one or two things that are particularly important for me as a Christian about science fiction. A number of years ago, Lawrence Krauss, a distinguished cosmologist, wrote a book called The Physics of Star Trek. It's a nice little read. You can read it in an afternoon, and you can discover why warp drive is possible, but not practically possible. You can think about how matter could be transformed in lots of different ways. And Krauss took a little bit of flack from the scientific community about writing about such things as Star Trek. He defended it by saying that he did an informal survey on campus and discovered that more people had heard of Beam Me Up Scotty than had heard of ketchup. And he went on to say, for me, science fiction and Star Trek is a natural vehicle for people's curiosity about the universe. The book contains a foreword by Stephen Hawking. And Stephen wrote, science fiction like Star Trek is not only good fun, but it also serves a serious purpose, that of expanding the human imagination. I find that interesting. It's fun, and let's not lose the sense that this is fun. But it also has that serious purpose of expanding the human imagination. We could say the same thing about fantasy genres and many other things. Now, with all of that said, what I intend to do is use Star Wars as the way into this. Not to say that this is more important than Marvel or Star Trek, and we had an informal whooping this morning during the service from Marvel fans compared to Star Trek fans. I'm going to start with Star Wars, and I'm going to try and be specific about Star Wars as a way of opening up the space for conversation, so that if you have a particular interest that might resonate with you, or you might say, well, actually my interest in science fiction in such and such an area means that it's a different thing going on. Is that okay with everyone? I hope it is, because that's what I've prepared. And PowerPoint, unfortunately, means that what I've prepared you're going to get. I was a young teenager when I first saw Star Wars, which is now called A New Hope. I'd only seen one movie before that. It was Chitty Chitty Bang Bang on a wet Wednesday afternoon in a little town called Consett in the northeast of England. Seeing Star Wars as a young teenager and growing up with the first trilogy was part of my life. Just as my children have grown up with different movies and different stages of Star Wars, so it became embedded in me. And the story of Star Wars you probably know quite well. George Lucas, who created Star Wars, went to 2 movie studios and said, I've got this story set in space, and both of them said it'll never work. He went to 20th Century Fox, who gave him $100,000 to write the screenplay and quite a bit more to produce it. He had to use $1 million of his own money, which he'd made through the movie American Graffiti, in order to create what became this massive franchise of trilogies of movies and spin-offs and games and toys and all the rest of it. Now, if we ask just for a moment what may be the cultural and even scientific significance of Star Wars as a franchise, then I think 1 or 2 things are really quite important for me. The first is that science fiction like Star Wars imagines a universe which at the time was interesting as something which was grubby, physical, dusty, earthy, and richly populated. Now, the reality was that when Star Wars was created in the 1970s, we only knew of a few planets. We only knew of the planets around our own star, our own solar system. In fact, we didn't know whether there were any other planets in the universe at all until the mid-90s, when we began to discover exoplanets. And those of you who are Star Wars fans will know that Tatooine has 2 suns to it, 2 stars. And we thought to ourselves, well, that's just pure imagination, because you can't have a planetary system with 2 stars. That will never work. Don't trust a scientist who says it'll never work, because actually we have discovered now planets around other stars and around binary stars. Sometimes the imagining of science fiction flows through into scientific facts. Sometimes it doesn't. And there's a selection effect where people say, well, science fiction always predicts what happens in science. And it doesn't quite happen like that, but you remember the times it does happen. And we now are beginning to think that we're in a richly populated universe. This is our current count on numbers of planets outside our solar system. So these are the things that have been discovered since 1995, quite a short time. And this is true as of 2 o'clock this afternoon. It may not be true anymore, but there are 4,551 confirmed planets outside our solar system. And you see the breakdown there, that many of them are large gas giants like Jupiter and Neptune. Some are what are called super-Earths, which are slightly bigger than our Earth. But look at this, around about, 160 or 170 of Earth terrestrial type planets. Now, we've only surveyed a very small part of the sky. And you're distinguished academics, all of you. So you know that the Milky Way galaxy is, let me go back. The Milky Way galaxy is one of 100 billion galaxies in the universe. And in the Milky Way galaxy, there are 100 billion stars. So I know it's late on a Tuesday afternoon. How many stars are there in the universe? Very easy. You multiply 100 billion by 100 billion. The answer is a lot. That's something like the grains of sand on the beaches of the world. And if you imagine that a good percentage of those stars have planets around them, this is a richly populated universe. Now, don't make the wrong step of then saying, even if there are lots of Earths out there, that means there must be other intelligent life out there. That's not quite the right step to make, because you need certain things to be just right. in Goldilocks terms for other life. But science fiction introduces us to a richly populated universe, which is interesting theologically in terms of if we are to come across at some point other life, and we might want to talk about that in the question time in a moment. Culturally also, Star Wars introduced a digital special effects revolution in Hollywood. I mean, when I was watching Flash Gordon on the television in black and white as a child in the last century, when most of you weren't alive, you could see the little white strings holding the space rockets up. What the digital special effects revolution in Hollywood has done is to embody imagination in ways that become convincing and believable. And the third thing, of course, and I've already alluded to it, is merchandising and the event movie. Before Star Wars, major movies would not open with the big merchandising and the many, many screens release of big movies. That is now standard. That partly came in through Star Wars. And culturally, did Star Wars bring about an emphasis on spirituality? Well, that's a really interesting question, so let's move on to that. And different commentators at the time said different things. Here's some of my favorite quotes of commentators on Star Wars movies. Gabrielle Morris, a form of male autism for dysfunctional boys. But Kevin Smith, the biggest thing that did or ever will happen to our generation. Sarah Vine, the truth is that you really do need to be a male aged between 13 and 17 with no girlfriend to still get excited about Star Wars. And yet Ian Nathan, it changed my life for better, and I knew millions of others who were feeling exactly the same thing at exactly the same moment. Star Wars became part of us. And Max Bealby, for anyone whose formative years took place in the late 70s, Star Wars is a religious experience. Depends what we mean by religious experience, of course. In the 2001 UK census, you'll remember that a spoof email went round to say that if you answer Jedi Knight as your religion, then it will be accepted as an official religion. Nothing of the sort, but many people were taken in by it. If you look at the 2001 census, you saw that about 5.2% of people of other faiths, but in the no religion category were lumped Jedi Knights. A large percentage in 2001, and 390,000 people noted that they were Jedi Knights at this point. And the great thing about statistics and surveys is you can look at the geographical distribution of Jedi Knights in the UK. I thought you'd be interested in that tonight. Notice that Oxford and Cambridge are way up towards the top on that. That tells us a great deal. Easington, which is in the northeast of England, just down the road from where I live, has the lowest percentage of Jedi Knights in the country. In the 2011 census, you also see a smaller number claiming to be Jedi Knights. I'm sorry, the slide is a little too small for you to see. Now, what's going on in all of this? I think some of it is just having a bit of fun. I have, however, met a number of people within the science fiction community and talked with them, for whom this is a religion of the sense of saying there's more to the universe than meets the eye. And they find expression of this within certain forms of science fiction. The extreme of this is the way that certain cults have taken science fiction and built in. Do you remember the Heaven's Gate cult? The number of people who committed suicide in a mansion in San Diego. They took much of the mythology of Star Trek and put it into religion. I think Star Wars and science fiction, however, in general, is appealing to certain things within us. So what's the attraction of Star Wars? When The Phantom Menace came about, which seems a long, long time ago, so this was either movie number 4 or movie number 1, however you classify Star Wars movies. We took a camera onto the streets of Durham and we asked people what they liked about Star Wars. There is one eminent theologian in this clip. You'll probably tell who the eminent theologian is by what he says about science fiction.
I think basically sort of near the end, when it's all coming together and, but I've watched them all.
Did you like Return of the Jedi?
Because after the very first one, which got re-released obviously in the beginning, was actually pants, I thought. But the last one, that was the end of the story as far as I was concerned. Chewie.
Chewie?
Yeah.
Why do you like Chewie?
Oh, he's just big and hairy and class. Speaks my language.
None of them.
Why not?
I don't like science fiction. It's too boring. It's too young.
Escapism, very good. With friends to see it, I couldn't believe the special effects are absolutely brilliant. It's just a shame, really, because you think of Star Wars with Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher. It's just hard to think about it with Liam Neeson, Ewan McGregor, Natalie Portman. It's a completely different thing, but I suppose 20 or so years on, it's quite plausible, really.
I had like those little toys, you could get those. So I guess that'd be my favourite one. But I'm a fan of Darth Vader, and he sort of gets his own back on the goodies.
Why do you like Darth Vader?
I think his character's really cool, and I like this sort of evil side to it. It's quite good. I'm not sadistic myself, I just think he's a real cool character.
It's got a lot of the universals in there. It's got the good versus evil and good triumphing in the end, and it's big. It's very big, and the tech.
When George Lucas talks about Star Wars, he says the attraction is it's rather like an ice cream sundae, the type of thing that you get in a restaurant with lots of different ice creams and chocolate fudge brownies and all the rest of it. And Lucas says that what he piled into Star Wars were a whole number of things. So first of all, you've got the great mythical stories. The journey of the hero is Luke Skywalker. So it resonates with some of our classic stories being told in a different form. And then you throw in the Western. Remember, this was the mid-70s. The Western had gone out of fashion in Hollywood. There were certain television series for Westerns, but Han Solo becomes the gunslinger on the frontier. So the Western goes into there. And then science fiction serials, the styling of Star Wars comes from Lucas' fascination with Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon. That's thrown in there. And then the space race, this was the mid-70s. That sense of, we'd landed on the moon, what was next? We were making that big step into space, or maybe not by the end of the 70s. And then samurai movies, particularly Akira Kurosawa's 1958 movie, The Hidden Fortress, which tells of the journey of a princess across enemy territory, aided by an elderly general and with 2 bungling companions. And of course, that becomes Princess Leia with Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the 2 bungling companions providing the comedy are the 2 droids who go along with it. And then, interesting enough, there are little bits of religion sprinkled liberally through the movies. In The Empire Strikes Back, you get certain Buddhist themes appearing. In The Phantom Menace, the virgin birth picks up out of nowhere. Now the trouble, I think, with Christians like myself is that immediately we see little bits of religion, our eyes light up. And we concentrate on those little bits of religion that we see. And what we forget is to stay with the big questions. And I think part of the attraction of Star Wars for many people is something that you don't see to begin with, a bit like an ice cream sundae, and that's the glass that holds everything together. If you didn't have the glass, the whole thing would just be a mess on your tabletop. What the glass does, it gives structure to the thing. And I think the glass in Star Wars is some of the big themes within the movie narratives. And you've got to stay with those themes, not be distracted by the little bits of religion and say, well, it's all Buddhist or it's all Christian or it's a Christian allegory or whatever. So let me pick out just one or two of those. And the first is, of course, hope. Hope's a very important word in Star Wars, A New Hope, subtitled, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope," becomes one of the key phrases of the early stage. And Lucas was making this movie on the back of asking the question, where is hope based? Now, in 1971, he'd made a short science fiction movie called THX 1138. Let me just play you a little clip, the trailer to THX 1138. THX 1138 is not a particularly hopeful movie. It's a future which is oppressive, which rules out love. And Lucas wrote after that, I began to think that in order to do anything in film that will have social repercussions, you have to make an optimistic movie which gives hope. That way things can happen. And so Star Wars is about the small people triumphing over the evil empire. And particularly, it begins to ask the question, what is hope based on? And of course, hope can be based on lots of things. Hope can be based on cyclicity of history. The sun will come out tomorrow, sings Annie. The myth of human progress. That sense that education and science and technology will deliver us. Very popular at the beginning of the 20th century. And Gene Roddenberry bought into that, the creator of Star Trek. Roddenberry thought that once humanity, through science, had moved to the bridge of the Enterprise, then national divisions, racial divisions would be overcome in this common scientific quest. One or two problems with Klingons from time to time, but overall, that's the myth of human progress, which Roddenberry bought into. The trouble with the 20th century, as a great deal of other cinema shows us, is that the myth became a nightmare, as I mentioned this morning, where science can both deliver that which is good, but it also can deliver oppression in ever-increasing circles to it. What Lucas does, and what The Matrix did, and one or two other movies, is to say hope comes from the belief that there is more to life than appears. And for Lucas, that becomes a sense of transcendence. I'll come back to that in a moment. So hope is one of those big themes. And then an obvious theme of good and evil. You see this in lots of different ways, but not as an unsubtle thing. It's actually quite subtle in Star Wars. Yes, you get the big evil characters, the Darth Mauls and the Darth Vaders, exhibiting some kind of evil outside of us. But Vader, of course, has a backstory which begins with a small child, quite a cute child. The evil begins with a trade dispute on a rather unremarkable planet. This is where Palpatine and others gain their power from. Plot of Phantom Menace and the first trilogy was much criticized for this. But I think Lucas is saying that evil starts in small ways and begins to come into us as we give in to temptation, into pride, into bitterness, into feelings of revenge. And that sense of good and evil, that evil arises in unexpected ways, evil does exist apart from us. There is a tempting and there is a structural evil going on. Evil is to be fought inside of us, and that evil actually is defeated not only by force, but by self-sacrifice. When Alec Guinness read the script for Star Wars and he discovered that his character was going to be killed off halfway through, he almost refused to appear. But those defining moments of self-sacrifice become the defining moments of the whole series, whether that be Obi-Wan Kenobi or whether that be Vader's self-sacrifice for his son eventually. Self-sacrifice is embedded into overcoming evil. And then, so hope, good and evil. Let me now turn to the Force. Well, let's have just a clip or two about the Force and how it's embedded in popular culture. Wouldn't that be great for those of you who are church pastors at church councils to be able to do that and say, I find your lack of faith disturbing. Anyway, sorry, I'm going off on somewhere that I shouldn't go on that. Sir Alec Guinness was a devout Roman Catholic, and he was once coming out from Mass, and a Star Wars fan came up to him and said, may the Force be with you. To which Sir Alec replied without thinking, and also with you. And then thought to himself, what a stupid thing to say. Francis Ford Coppola said to Lucas, if you use this to found a religion, you could make lots and lots of money. Lucas replied, well, I've made quite a lot already, thank you very much. I don't think the Force is there to create a new religion. What popular culture is very good at is posing questions rather than providing answers. And I think what's going on is that the Force is embedded into the Star Wars movies to ask questions about where hope is based on, that sense of transcendence, but also to say that in the midst of a love of science and technology, which is there in the Star Wars movies, nothing wrong about that, there is something more than science can explain or technology can control. The Force becomes the way to defeat the Death Star. And for those of you who know a little bit about the science-religion debate, you'll remember that at the heart of 20th century popular thinking about science and religion has been this conflict model, that science and faith are in perpetual conflict and war. As, again, many of you will know, that is a recent invention. It was a model created by Darwin's bulldog, T.H. Huxley, in the 19th century, who had a small dining club. And this dining club had a particular problem. The problem was the Church of England. And the problem of the Church of England in the late 19th century was that the Church of England was in control of professional science. So in order to be professor of astronomy at Durham University in the 19th century, you had to be an ordained Anglican clergyman to do it. The presidents of the British Association of Science had to be bishops. Huxley and others wanted to move science into its own professional realm. And as the historian Colin Russell showed, this X-club, this dining club that they formed, thought and created ways to move science away from the church. And one of the most successful was the conflict model of science and faith. And a number of historians in the 19th century took this and rewrote Galileo and Darwin from the vantage point of conflict and warfare. I think what Lucas is doing with the Force is he is chipping away at the conflict model to say that actually you can have a love of science, but there is something as well as science going on. I say this because this is what he's written. I would hesitate to call the force God. It's designed primarily to make young people think about mystery. Not to say, here's the answer. It's to say, think about this for a second. Is there a God? What does God look like? What does God sound like? What does God feel like? How do we relate to God? So I think there's something really quite profound in this. That popular culture acts to raise questions. And I think this gives us a space to begin to engage as Christians. So, up to this point, if you're still with me, I've tried to say a little bit about the big questions. Where is hope to be found? What's the nature of evil? How can evil be overcome? And is there more to the universe than that which science can describe and technology master? Now, remember what I said about, I'm taking Star Wars here. This isn't normative for all other forms of science fiction. Star Trek is an interesting example at this point, because under Roddenberry's influence, Star Trek in the early series were very anti-religious. If God appeared, it was often a false God. As the series franchises developed into Deep Space Nine and into Voyager, under Rick Berman, you began to see little bits of spirituality and religion begin to appear within the franchise. It evolved to open up questions of whether there was more to the universe than just the science. With the Marvel universes, you've got a whole range of different interactions in this. But I think they are all asking questions in the sense of fun movies, which are meant to make money and sell things, remember all of that? But they're opening up that space. Lucas was very honest. All I was trying to say in a very simple and straightforward way is that there is a God and there is a good and a bad side. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not signing him up on the Christian side. His self-description is often he is a Buddhist Methodist. I've met many of those, by the way, over the years. Here's someone who's good at asking questions. What might that mean as we begin to engage with science fiction in mission and ministry and the real world? And of course, some science fiction now overlaps very much with the real world. I mean, when William Shatner went into space, I mean, there are a number of bad puns of newspaper headlines to take him there. We don't want to use it badly. But let's go back to why some Christians feel a little embarrassed engaging. And I think part of this comes from an analysis done by scholars like Lawrence Levine and others. Levine, in this book, Highbrow, Lowbrow, The Emergence of a Cultural Hierarchy in America, argued that in Western culture, there has been a division between highbrow arts and lowbrow arts. The highbrow arts of classical music, the lowbrow arts of rock and roll. A number of Christian scholars, like Bill Romanowski and others, have taken this and said the church has often bought into this. We've sanctified the highbrow arts and either demonized or trivialized the lowbrow arts. Now, of course, in art, as you all well know, there's good art and there's bad art. But I don't think it's about highbrow being good and lowbrow being bad. I think the Christian is called to encounter art in a critical and affirming way, and to see what it's saying about human existence. In Gordon Lynch's book, Exploring Theology and Popular Culture, Lynch says that exploring popular culture is important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it tells us something about the relationship of religion and everyday life. I think it then tells us something about the religious functions of pop culture, the way that certain things can become a substitute for patterns, rhythms, rituals of religion. I think it tells us something about an appropriate missiology for Western culture, and that pop culture becomes potentially a medium for theological reflection. And this is where I think us relearning or moving into a different form of apologetics is very important. And I see that here at LST, by the way, in terms of the number of things that you do in music and counselling and other things, and engaging with science. Alistair McGrath, many years ago, in this book, Bridge Building, wrote this definition of Christian apologetics. The chief goal of Christian apologetics is to create an intellectual and imaginative climate conducive to the birth and nurture of faith. I like that, because often Christian apologetics has been an intellectual climate on the defensive, waiting for attacks to be given of the Christian faith. So that in Alan Richardson's classic book called Christian Apologetics, he says that Christian apologetics is a defensive movement where Christians need to talk about the attacks upon the Christian faith amongst themselves and then engage with the world. It's almost a sense of we take a step back, go into our holy huddle, and then go out on a guerrilla raid trying to bring people back to our holy huddle. McGrath is saying apologetics is not just an intellectual engagement, but it's also an imaginative engagement through music, poetry, drama. We know that within church, but what does it mean to take that on board as we engage with culture? And therefore, I think, for me, science fiction, there's a number of ways that in a missionary encounter, a missiological encounter, things become important. I think, first of all, there's something about just affirming the fun of imaginative stories. One of the things that strikes me about the ministry of Jesus, as different from mine, well, I mean, that's a very long list, but one of the things that Jesus does is those moments where he unexpectedly affirms that which is good. Now, I'm a teetotal Methodist. I don't drink alcohol. So the most embarrassing miracle for me is John chapter 2, the changing of the water into wine. And the most extraordinary thing about that miracle story, of course, is that he changes between 120 to 180 gallons of water into wine. I mean, at the end of the party, when most people are already drunk. Now, biblical scholars far greater than me will talk about the I ams and the way that John's gospel weaves this and all the rest of it, but I can't get past the point that Jesus seemed to love parties through that miracle. He seems to affirm that which gives joy. I think if I'm honest, and I look at my own preaching as a Christian, I'm very good at condemning or critiquing. I'm not always as good about affirming that which is gift. And whether it be science as gift, technology as gift, story as gift, there's something that I think missiologically is important for me to do that. I think the second thing is that I need to listen to these stories patiently. What Michael Dyson calls ethical patience. The problem is that I'm too quick to judge a story and move quickly from it. I need to live with the stories, stay with the stories, rather than looking for quick things that I can object to or quick illustrations for sermons. And so paying careful attention to listening to the story needs to be very important. And I remember that vividly as a child, a 7-year-old, in a Methodist chapel. And the preacher was talking about Dr. Spock from Star Trek. And I knew immediately at the age of 7 that there was something inauthentic about this, because I was a Star Trek fan, and I knew it was Mr. Spock in Star Trek, and rather than Dr. Spock, who was an American childcare expert in the 1960s. If I'm going to speak, I need to live with these stories patiently. And then I think there's something about theological playfulness in this. I mean, those of you who are students, I mean, it's a serious business doing theology, isn't it? I mean, it's hard at times. But actually, theology is also a playful thing. And stories and narratives allow us to do some theological thinking with a bit of fun. In the mid-part of the 20th century, before Vatican II, you find a whole number of science fiction stories coming from Roman Catholic writers. And my guess is that actually what was happening there was a number of Roman Catholic writers were asking the question of whether there was salvation outside of the church without having to talk about the P word, the Protestant. In the world of aliens, you could talk about salvation without the immediate political dimension. What does it mean for this kind of area to be a theological sandpit where I can go and play and speculate and think? And then, I've forgotten my next point, so I better put the PowerPoint on. This isn't for everyone. I mean, this is a seminar which comes out of my interests and my fascination. I'm not saying by this that everyone who's engaging in Christian mission needs to know about Star Wars or Star Trek or Marvel. All I'm doing is offering, I think, something from my experience to try and stimulate what's important for you. What is the part of popular culture that you engage with, that speaks to you? Great Anglican evangelist and preacher David Wilkinson used to say to preachers, never fall into temptation and buy that little book which is entitled 300 Jokes to Tell in a Sermon. You know those books that are on offer? He said, if you do fall into temptation and buy that little book, then at least only use the jokes that make you laugh out loud. Because if something doesn't get you, it won't then build a bridge. So maybe you're a science fiction fan, great. Maybe you're not. But what is it for you that allows you to build bridges, intellectual and imaginative bridges with popular culture? And then I think I want to be open that if Jesus is Lord of all, if Jesus is the one through whom all things are created, then there will be surprising sacramental moments where I encounter the Lord in a way that charms me, enlightens me, disturbs me, and others. I do something called Thought for the Day on Radio 4. Mark referred to it earlier, and you get 2 minutes 45 seconds to try and connect something in the news that morning to the Christian gospel. It terrifies me every time I do it. And I remember talking to a great hero of mine, a Methodist preacher called Donald English, who did Thought for the Day for a number of years, and said to him, what gives you the confidence to go in front of 7 million people and try and connect something with Jesus? I expected him to say, well, because I've been preaching for 60 years, I've got all of these illustrations, all the rest of it. He said, what gives me confidence is John chapter 1, Colossians chapter 1, and Hebrews chapter 1. Remember those cosmic pictures of Jesus? Those of you here in the service, we looked at one of them. And Donald's point was, because if you have a big enough view of Jesus, then there is nothing within the universe, within popular culture, that doesn't have some connection to the Lord. It may take you a long time to find it. Normally does for me on a Sunday as I'm trying to struggle with it. But it's there because he is the Lord. Mark, I think I've gone on for far enough at this point. I'm really happy now to have criticism, comments, questions, contributions. Is that all right? I think we've got a roving mic, haven't we? So that's great. Now, if no one wants to ask a question, we'll just go and have tea. But it'd be great to have some conversation together. Thank you very much. Great. Yeah. Someone at the back and then at the front. Thank you.
Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Okay. So on this idea of that we can sit around in a particular universe of particular movies and world build, I guess what is your criteria for whether or not such a story is profitable?
Yeah.
Take something like Game of Thrones. I haven't seen it, but I know of many series which are quite raunchy, don't necessarily have that good moral ending or moral commandment, stuff like that. But I'm wondering, is there any profit, or is the loss just too much? What's your view on that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important question. And I don't have an easy answer to that. Partly because I think it depends on us. And we all have different emotional sensitivities. We all have different backstories. And there are certain things that will touch us in the wrong way in certain contexts. However, it's interesting that John Stott, a great evangelical leader, once was questioned about this. And Stott did go and watch some very raunchy movies at the time. But he always went with a group of people. He never watched alone. So that post the movie, he was able to deconstruct with others what the movie was about and his own reactions to it. Now that, I think, is a very good model to do, so that it's not something that is simply a private thing, but we actually are able to talk about it with others. Because I think, although there are certain things that Christians will say that's too violent or too raunchy, I don't hear many Christians say, well, that was subtly racist, or that was subtly consumerist. Because often those things we go to, and because we're not sensitive to them, they imbibe in us. Was it Ron Sider in that old book, Rich Christians in Age of Hunger, said, the values of an affluent society seep subtly into us. The only way to resist them is by Christian fellowship. Now, I think that's true, so there's something about that. I think then there's also something which is about the portrayal of the world without hope, the portrayal of the world without God, the portrayal of the world without ethics or morals. I think there's a reality to that. Now, we see it in news all of the time, but often some of the most compelling drama that I've seen has been showing me a world without grace, a world without hope. Some of it is very raw. And so in our college chapel, we have We have a 12th century college chapel in Durham, and it's a very small, much smaller than this, very intimate space. And sometimes we allow our undergraduates to do drama in it. And I remember one particular play, which was a play about suicide, where a number of Christian folks said, we can't allow this into the chapel. It's not a Christian play, it's very raw, the language, the imagery, the questions that it poses. But actually having it in the chapel was the most profound experience of seeing this played out and seeing the questions there. So I'm sorry that's not an easy kind of response, but those would be some of the things for us to have a cup of coffee about and talk more. I think it varies, yeah. Down here and then we'll, yeah.
My question was, Hi, my question was a little similar, but I'll twist it slightly. I think a lot of the resistance I've encountered towards this type of thing comes from Christians themselves. So, for example, attitudes towards something, say, Harry Potter or the Force in the Jedi, which is almost this fear of anything that might be spiritual or magic that is not overtly Christian.
Yes.
So, do you have any tips with how to engage in that, in a graceful, non-judgmental way?
Yeah, thank you. Not least just having gone through Halloween, and I think it's a really, really important question. I think first of all, we've just got to be realistic about certain things. So the first book that was published on Harry Potter, to my knowledge, was a book called Harry Potter, The Menace Behind the Magic. And it had two main critiques of Harry Potter. One was that Ron and Harry actually weren't very good at school, and they used wrong language, and they didn't give a Christian impression for young children on how to behave. The second was that it led people into the occult. Now, that second point was made without real evidence at all. And so you hear some of these stories going on, and often there are anecdotes, but we need to be careful not to go overboard on them. I'm sure that in science fiction and other things, these stories have been taken too far for some people, and it's led them into the occult or something like it. But we need to be careful not to exaggerate that. I think we need to be open to the world being more subtle and complex than simply, here's the world of science and here's the world of Christianity. And so within Scripture, the world of angels and demons is presented without shame, without embarrassment. That there are forces and there are powers, principalities that are real. Now, what I didn't have time for in the Colossians passage this morning is that when Paul is talking about Jesus as supreme in all things, there's a sense in which he's talking directly to the Colossians who may have been obsessed with intermediaries between heaven and earth, demons and spirits. And that's why he says, for in him all principalities, powers were created. So these things are real, but Jesus is supreme. And I think part of our role is to talk about the lordship of Christ, and not to allow people to become obsessed or too worried about it. However, having said that, I refer to my previous answer in that for particular personalities and particular contexts and particular backgrounds, care needs to be taken. Now, I think that's where structures of family and Christian community become really important, because we're not all the same on this. And for different age groups and for different personality types, we've got to be careful Very important question. Thank you.
Thank you. I've just maybe just throw in a thought to sort of contrast all of that.
Yeah.
Christians may have difficulties with certain elements of science fiction, but I wonder how many Christians sort of stop watching David Attenborough or Brian Cox or some of these other characters simply because they are quite dismissive of Christianity, even though they're doing programs that show the wonders of the universe or nature, you know, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really interesting. And it goes back to the fact that sometimes, because of our tradition within the West, we've become very hesitant about certain things, but not other things. Now, Attenborough is very explicit that he doesn't believe in God. Brian Cox is more of an interesting character. The Bishop of Leeds had a clergy day where I was invited with Brian Cox for a day with 400 church leaders. He was terrific. I mean, absolutely terrific. In engaging with theological questions. He was very clear he wasn't a Christian. But in that type of setting, there was a different type of discourse to some of the things that you often get presented within the public arena. So we do have to be careful and critical of all of this. And we do have to, I think, engage. Because the thing was that the Bishop of Leeds and the 400 clergy engaged with Brian Cox, and actually, he respected that. And part of our work in equipping Christian leadership in the age of science is what we try and do is we bring bishops and those at senior levels of church leadership, and we throw them into a laboratory with leading scientists. What we don't do is choose scientists who happen to be Christians, because we believe that the encounter, both for the senior church leader and for the scientist, becomes in its rawness a really fruitful encounter. And what's fascinating is the number of scientists who turn up at the bar to talk to bishops later on. So I think let's keep our critical faculties about us, whatever it is. Point well taken. But also let's find ways to engage on a personal level. And I mean, you know, I'll mention tonight Richard Dawkins and you know, Richard Dawkins and one or two of the other new atheists, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. But if you read Dawkins' social media and website, some of the Christian contributions are horrendous. And you wonder to yourself why some of these people become so anti. And I think it's because we need to just take time to engage. And we can do that with our friends and family and our workmates who have different views. Yeah, thank you. Good point.
Is it working? Yes. First off, thank you, Professor Wilkinson, for such a fantastic lecture. As someone who grew up with a dad who was a fanatic for Star Trek and grew up on it, it's very appreciative.
Thank you for being in the same age group as your dad. It's great. Yeah.
I wanted to kind of ask a question off the back of this idea of theological playfulness. There's a culture within kind of the church and seeping into the academy that kind of says, we do theology in this one totalitarian, linear way, and if you to come off that path, then you are, whatever label they give you, false teacher, heretic, etc. And I guess not just within the realm of science fiction, but also within the realm of other, for example, we just come off Halloween, and there's a large argument that would say that those that partake in Halloween partake in witchcraft and that kind of argument. So I wonder how, working with church leaders yourself, how you would encourage more of a positive view of quote-unquote theological playfulness to the extent where we're not, again, going down the judgmental route, but at the same time sticking sticking well to our theological convictions?
Yeah, thank you. What an important question again. And, I notice that I'm being recorded at this point, and the yawning chasm of being characterized as unorthodox at this point opens before me. I say it. I think for me, theology and science at core is about trying to find the right questions to ask. So that science, as Tom McLeish, my friend, would say, is more about learning to ask the right questions than finding the answers. And I think there's something here in theology which is about the affirmation of a community which takes seriously an inherited tradition and takes seriously questions of orthodoxy. I don't want to get away from that. And depending on whether you're an evangelical or you're from a particular traditionalist stream which looks towards tradition, church tradition more. But I think the community which allows questions seems to me really important. So is it a community where Thomas would feel that he could ask questions? Thomas, as you know, is not the doubter. He's the questioner, the person who asks the questions that everyone else is too embarrassed to ask. Now, if we can develop a community within the church where within small groups, within after church coffee, people can ask the type of questions that other people are too embarrassed to ask. Seems to me that that's what being church is about. And theological playfulness, I think, comes from a confidence that we aren't about defending God. That old thing about Spurgeon when he was asked to defend the Bible. Why would I want to defend the Bible? Like defending a lion. We're not here in apologetics to defend God. The confidence that we see in Jesus, the truth of God, I think allows us then the grace and the openness to play with the questions. So I think those church leaders who I most admire, sorry, Mark, you want to finish, but let me just tell you this small. We've been working with some of the black-led churches as part of our project, and pastor of Wembley Community Church, Alton Bell, is a great leader, and he came to us and said, let's do something on, is it right for us as Christians to be vaccinated? So we said, yeah, what a great thing. So he said, we'll do it online. And he got together a panel of theologians and scientists who talked about vaccination. And I joined the Zoom meeting. And there were 470 people on the Zoom meeting. And the chat function on Zoom, I have never seen anything like it. Conspiracy theory, questions, the whole lot. I couldn't keep up with reading the chat because it was going so quickly. And Alton, after the panel had discussed, starts to pick on some of the most outrageous questions that were in the chat. Now, I would have ignored them. I would have gone to the safe questions. But he knew, and he's so gentle about it. He was so confident that he allowed people to ask these questions. And what it did was it brought out some of the deeper things that we never would have got into if they hadn't asked the questions. Now, that's what I admire. That's theological confidence, but being open to questions.